Today we are making a lovely pair of velvet green stays. It's for a ball I'm going to in 2 days, so we kind of don't have a lot of time, so just come in and I'll show you how I make them. So I'm going to a ball and I don't have an outfit. The theme is 16 to 1700s and I don't really have time to make a completely new outfit, so I'm going to use a lot of what I have. The plan is to wear my green Minerva gown. This is my favorite gown that I make. It's also one of the first I ever made for my brand. Usually I wear it on its own or pair it with different underskirts, but today I thought we could do something really fun inspired by the 1600s, where I wanted to make like a pair of stays that goes over the dress. When I do projects like this, I like to use all of my fabric waste and not buy anything new. So this is going to be a no waste project for me. My plan is to wear a chemise underneath the dress, then my big white petticoat, then my Minerva gown, and then wear the stays on top of the gown. I think it will be very cute. Today I'm going to be using a pattern by RedThreaded. This is their 70-50s stays pattern. I really like their stays patterns. I previously made the 70-80s front closing stays. This time I'm not making a mock-up because I've already made 2 pairs of the other type of stays. I know this one is a little bit different, but I think I kind of know what I need to alter. I'm going to be taking it in a little bit, and I'm also going to move this peak right here a little bit in, because when I made the last mock-up of this pattern, it is a little bit too wide and it kind of hits me right in the armpit, which is not very nice. I would always recommend to make a mock-up, even if you kind of know what you need to alter, but do as I say, not as I do. As you can see, I've moved the peak here a little bit in and just cut out kind of to match the pattern. I've used my current stays as kind of a guide, but I've kept it a little bit wider than last time because I want to kind of preserve the style of a little bit wider pair of stays. For the strength layer portion, I'm going to be using a kind of thick cotton canvas fabric. I don't have a lot left, so I'm just going to be mindful when cutting out the fabric. For this project, I am going to be using this as a layer on top of my dress, so I want the stays to look really nice. And I think that this will be absolutely lovely. And then I'm just going to be lining with this normal kind of cotton canvas fabric. The velvet cotton is kind of stretchy, so I'm a little bit scared of how it's going to be turning out. I haven't made that many corsets, and I haven't kind of seen anyone make a pair of stays with velvet cotton, but I think it's going to work out nicely. So I'm going to be cutting out 2 layers of the canvas cotton and then 1 layer of the fashion fabric, the velvet cotton, and then 1 layer of the lining. Now I'm going to be flatlining the fashion fabric, which in my case is the velvet fabric, to the layers of lining that we have. Now I'm just going to take the velvet cotton I have and stitch it to one of the lining pieces. I am doing 4 layers in total. I think the pattern recommends to use 3 layers, 1 fashion fabric, 1 strength layer, and then 1 lining layer. But I'm going to be using 4 because my lining layer is not going to be stitched down with the boning channels. It's just going to kind of lay nicely on top on the inside of the body. I don't always follow the seaming guide. I just kind of do what I want to myself. Now I'm just going to stitch all around all the pieces so that the cotton fabric kind of connects to the strength layer. I am also going to be sewing around the tabs so that they are marked from the front. Currently we have 1 layer of velvet cotton and 1 layer of the canvas. Now I'm going to be placing the belly piece to the other canvas layer, and I don't have any fusible lining, so I'm just going to use 2 pieces of the same thick canvas fabric. Because I'm doing like a final kind of lining layer, I wasn't sure if I should place this belly piece on that or the fabric I'm using as the inner boning layer, but I'm going to be doing it on the fabric that I'm going to sandwich the boning in between. I'm not sure if that's the best idea, but it's what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to be marking the boning channels. I'm going to do this with a pencil and a ruler. There are multiple ways to mark boning channels, and if you are following a lots of historical costumers, they usually have their own preferred way of doing it. I'm just going to be using the materials that I have right here in my studio. Even though I make clothes every day for a living, I don't always follow the most professional techniques when I make just clothing for myself. And when I started my YouTube channel, I kind of wanted to show you how you can make clothing without having a lot of professional tools. In my other studio, I have like this ruler which have a 1 centimeter line, so that would be pretty handy right now. But I don't think most people have tools like that. You usually have just what's accessible at your house, and I don't feel like to be able to sew nice things you have to go out and buy a lot of tools and special things to make clothing. I've just marked the boning channels on the inner layer, and we're just going to be sewing pretty much everything together. The seam guide says that you should sew all the seams except the front side seams together first. I'm just going to be starting with the canvas right here. Because I took a little bit in at the sides, I have marked where all the notches are supposed to go. I am using polyester thread. Usually I would use cotton. If you sew in only cotton, you should absolutely use cotton. But right now I'm just using polyester because that's what I have, and I really want everything to be able to stay. I don't really wash my stays either, so I don't feel like there's a problem with the shrinking. I haven't really sewn that many stays, so if any of you have experience with sewing with cotton thread, I would love to hear it. This is my new, very old Singer machine. It doesn't have like a centimeter guide for sewing, so I'm just going to be marking my seam allowance. I just got this machine and I think it's so nice. This is the first project I've done on it, and I haven't gone through and serviced it yet or deep cleaned it or done anything with it because I haven't had time. And before I took a large amount of time to do anything with it, I wanted to try it first on a project. So it's kind of exciting for me. It's a Singer 2121. It's a Singer 201K and it's electrical. It also has backstitching, which I really wanted. I have used a couple of hand winding machines before, but I really wanted to have one that was a little bit easier to sew with. And I think that this is really nice. I really wanted a vintage machine to use for my personal project like this. And it's kind of funny because it almost reminds me more of my industrial sewing machine than a normal sewing machine, which I really love because I absolutely love my industrial sewing machine. So as you can see, I've sewn together the front side, the back side and the back. And I'm going to be doing the same thing with my velvet pieces. I think these red-threaded stays patterns are really easy to assemble because I sew so much for my business. I don't always get to make stuff for myself, so it's really fun each time I have the time. I'm also going to be marking the seam allowance on this side. What I really like about this machine so far is that it takes kind of thick fabrics. For example, for this seam, I have 2 layers of cotton velvet, which is really thick and heavy. And I also have 2 layers of pretty stiff canvas. And I absolutely love that the machine sews right through. My industrial machine does as well, but not my normal like house machine. It couldn't handle this at all. It would just make the threads go crazy. I do have a little trick that I like to use. For example, in this seam here, one of these sides are cut a little bit on the bias, so it's a little bit more stretchy and appears a bit longer. So always when I encounter seams like this, I always sew with the non-stretchy side up, if that makes sense. So if one of the pieces appear a bit longer or more stretchy or anything, I never have that side up. I always have the other tighter side up towards the foot of the machine. I don't know if a lot of other people do this, but I think it's so much easier because the foot will always stretch out the tighter side a little bit. It makes it so much easier if you always do this. So I'm going to be marking my seam allowance on the tighter side of the fabric. I usually also will always start all of my seams at the top part and not at the bottom. For example, with the Minerva gown that I produce myself, I sew everything from top up because I find that if I sew one breast seam here top down and the other bottom up, it may wrinkle the fabric a little bit or create some unevenness. So it's kind of a rule that I have. So if you don't have a lot of fabric, like with these stays, there isn't really a problem because you can just turn it, and instead of sewing like this, which is the normal way to sew with the fabric facing outwards, I will flip it and sew it like this. This can make it a little bit harder also if you don't have like a measuring guide on each side of the foot. So that's why I also like to mark the seaming allowances if I do this. But especially when I produce clothing myself, I'm really meticulous that everything is sewn from the top down. When I make clothes for myself, I'm not always that particular, but I think it's always nice to have like a set way of doing it each time so that every garment comes out the same. Now I'm just ironing all the seams open. So I've just traced the lines with a pencil, because if you use like a pen that I usually do, that comes out with heat. All the markings you've worked so hard for get removed when you iron it, and you don't want that. Now it says on the seaming guide to marry the layers together. I don't always follow the seam guides for everything that I sew, because I usually just do it how I want to. I feel like if you've sewn a lot, you know what I'm talking about. You have your own special way to do it. I have a little bit of a harder time writing seam guides for the patterns I make. That's why I do video tutorials, because I find it much easier. But I'm finishing a new pattern right now, and this time I think I will have a lot of people read my seam guides and also include photos, because I get that people like that. And again, I'm just marking my seaming allowance. And again, on the seam, I have a piece that seems to be a little bit longer than the other piece. I had to cut some of the canvas lining on not exactly the grain pattern, because I ran out of fabric. But this is a no-waste project for me. So I'm just going to be careful when I stitch so that everything is nice. A lot of people think if you sew professionally, you are an expert at sewing all types of clothing. But I feel like every time I start a new project that I haven't done before, or especially now when I'm making Petter's bunad, which is the traditional clothing of Norway, I feel like I'm a beginner again, because I feel like I lose all my knowledge the second I start a new project. And then it says to iron it open, so I'm going to do that. And then we probably are going to start to sew the boning channels. I think this part is so fun, because now you suddenly almost have like a corset. Now I'm going to sew the boning channels, and I personally think that this is kind of one of the hardest parts, especially because I had to use a little bit of scrap fabric, so not all the layers have the exact same kind of stretch ratio, which makes it a ton harder. I feel like you should always baste this first, but sometimes if you sew a lot through the velvet, you are going to leave some marks. So I'm just going to be basting it a little bit and then kind of hope for the best. If it doesn't come out too neatly on the lining side, it is okay, because I am lining the piece anyway. This is one of the reasons I could never make corset or stays for selling, because I feel like it's hard to get completely perfect. So I'm going to pin everything together, and I'm going to baste a tiny amount just where there's no boning channels. I'm doing quite big stitches because I don't really want to have so many marks in the velvet. Ever since I started making clothing for a living, I rarely get to do fun other projects like this, because I do most of my own production, so I usually just sit and sew the same thing over and over and over. And it is a lot of fun, and I'm really grateful to be able to do it. But there is something special about being able to make stuff that's a little bit different and not always doing the same thing over and over. Right here, I'm just going to be pinning. As you can see here, this is what happens if you use layers with a little bit of stretch when you are working with layers with no stretch. But sometimes that's just the way it is. When you do no-waste project like this, you can't always do everything perfectly, but I think that's kind of charm as well. I am actually a sewer that doesn't really have a lot of scrap fabric, but I rarely buy fabric for myself. That's maybe once a year if I'm making like a special Christmas gown or anything like that. That's actually why I bought the green velvet, but then I ended up using black velvet instead. Right here as well, I'm not going to be basting because it's such a flat surface. I feel like it's good. Then I will just iron over it a tiny amount to flatten the fabric a little bit. When I iron, I'm not going to be ironing over the needles because that will kind of create holes in the velvet, and I'm going to be very careful careful not to press it really hard because I don't want to dent the velvet at all. And now I'm going to sew the boning channels. This is what I hate to do the most. But it has to be done. It usually comes out pretty nicely. I would never sell finished stays just because of this part. Because no matter what I do, I never seem to get it perfect, and that really annoys me. I'm just going to be doing the same thing on the front. Here also I'm going to baste a little bit. I am again going to be quite generous with how wide I'm basting, just to not disturb the velvet. I actually really hated basting, but now I kind of enjoy it. I'm now going to be stitching the boning channels, and I'm going to be very, very meticulous about only sewing from the top down. I think it's impossible to not get any pulling at all on the fabric. So it's much better to just sew in the same direction all the time so that you don't get opposite pulling. When I come to the boning channel that goes across here, I'm just going to cut the thread and then move it down and keep sewing. I know it's very tempting to just turn and sew from this angle once you get to the other side, because you kind of will have to bend the fabric a little bit while you sew. But I do really think it's very important to sew from the top down. Isn't this just absolute perfection? This velvet is kind of stretchy, so just imagine how bulky it would be if I hadn't been very meticulous with my basting earlier. Now I'm just going to be putting in the boning, and on the seam guide they said to put the horizontal bone behind the vertical bones, so that's what I'm going to do. I am using plastic boning because that's what I have. It now says on the pattern to bind everything and then assemble it together at the end, but since I am adding another layer of fabric, I'm just going to assemble it first and then bind later. I also kind of want to check the fit because I haven't made a mock-up, and I have measured it against my 1780 stays, and the fit is looking a little bit different. It is looking quite good, but I just want to firstly assemble it, and then I will just line the whole thing with some green fabric at the end and then bind it, if that makes sense. I think it looks quite nice, so I think I can safely just assemble it and then layer everything together. I kind of just cut out and made a whole piece of the green cotton lining. With my other pair of stays, I just missed having another layer on the inside of the body. You can see here that I've pinned all the fabric down in the seams, and later I will just go in and hand stitch each seam so that all the seams on the lining are fastened. I also decided not to line the outer part here where the eyelets are going to be. I will just hand stitch this later. I'm going to be making the binding out of just this 100% cotton I'm using for the lining. I think that will look very nice. I contemplated doing the binding in velvet as well, but that's a little bit harder to do, and I think the cotton detail will add a little bit of texture, which I absolutely love. So I'm going to start with just binding the top part right here, and I'm going to sew 1/2 centimeter in. Now I just sewed on my self-made binding, and I'm just going to fold it over. I think maybe I'm just going to hand stitch it down because I think it's a little bit easier to get neater on the inside if I do it by hand. I don't know if you can see very well because it's a little bit dark in here, but I'm very happy about my choice to use cotton binding. I think it gives the stays a very, very nice detail. Plus, it's a little bit easier than doing in the velvet fabric. Now I'm going to start binding the bottom piece. I feel like this part is maybe the hardest. I can't really remember how it was when I did it last. I'm going to go in and cut all the boning a little bit. Now I've sewed the bias on all the tabs, and I'm also going to be cutting off any excess fabric. I find this part a little bit nitpicky. And I'm just going to fold the binding all around and just pin it down. Okay, so I've just finished the stays. I don't know if it's hard to see, but I did close all the bias tape here by hand, both on the bottom and the top. I really wanted to finish it by the ball, and I've used approximately 2.5 days on it, which I think is kind of good. I actually did really like how the lining came out. I did a type of lacing that's called spiral lacing. Spiral lacing is done a little bit differently than normal lacing. I don't know if you can see, but I also finished all the eyelets by hand. I don't really like metal grommets. I don't think they look as good as hand-sewn eyelets, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I do think it looks very nice, and I can't wait to wear it a lot. I do think the velvet fabric is absolutely beautiful, and I do think that the lining came out as well as I'd hoped. I'm going to order another type of like synthetic whalebone, because the boning I use now I'm not that happy with. It's just like plastic boning, so I think it would be cool to have a little bit more of a more authentic look. I'm going to show you what it looks like on. So here is my finished pair of stays. I think they came out absolutely amazing, if I may say so myself. The pattern is really nice and simple to use. I'm not sure how it looks in the back because I had to lace it myself. The fit is lovely as well. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I also do post video tutorials when I release my sewing patterns, and I plan to talk a little bit more about the clothing industry as a small business owner. I do already have a couple of videos out, so I would recommend to go check them out as well. Thank you so much. I would love to hear what you think of my new stays and my new outfit.